This afternoon's panel, we're going to focus on practice and policy. We've asked 3 panelists to prepare remarks of about 10 to 15 minutes, identifying what they believe to be the 5 key policy issues in juvenile justice, and then give us their recommendations for reform. After that, we're going to open up the mic for comments and questions from all of you. The bios of our 3 speakers are in your packet. I just want to highlight a couple of things. Our first speaker, Valeria Lawson, is the Executive Director of the Juvenile Justice Commission here in New Jersey. While Director Lawson is recently joined the Juvenile Justice Commission, I think she brings a great background to that position, both with her work on the New Jersey Parole Board, working with juveniles, but more importantly with her vast experience as a licensed clinical social worker on child study teams. We've heard from many speakers today the importance of education in helping these youth, and I think that's a great addition to the Juvenile Justice Commission. Schools should be at the table, and unfortunately, they're often the last stakeholder asked. Brian Hancock is the Deputy Division Director of the Division of Child Behavioral Health at the New Jersey Department of Children and Families. It's quite a mouthful. Brian works on mental health issues with juveniles in all systems currently, but I've known Brian since he worked at the Office of the Child Advocate, where he focused on the mental health issues of juveniles in detention, and I hope he shares that insight with us. Sandra Simkins is an associate professor with the Rutgers School of Law in Camden, New Jersey. She brings insight from years of experience representing juveniles in Philadelphia. I've always thought it a good idea to learn what works in other systems. So while most of us are from New Jersey here, it'll be nice to hear what's worked in other jurisdictions. And we're going to start with Director Lawson.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say this has been a great conference so far, and I really feel honored to be on the panel with all of these wonderful speakers who have a lot more experience than I do. I became Executive Director of the Juvenile Justice Commission about 8 months ago, and since that time, I've become increasingly aware that many of my own life experiences have been similar to those of the youth that come through our doors every day. One of those examples is that I have had more extended family members go to jail than to college. I witnessed their lost potential, and I'd like to share with you the story of one of my cousins. His name is Jimmy. He was a talented artist, but the only place that his art was ever exhibited was at the New Jersey Training School for Boys when he was 14 years old. The cards were stacked against him from the beginning. He was abandoned by both parents, being learning disabled, and subsequently he abused drugs. Sadly, none of these systems that we're discussing here today adequately met his needs. And witnessing his experience is one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about my desire to make a difference in the lives of children within the juvenile justice system. Each of the members of this panel was asked to identify the 5 policy areas in juvenile justice that we feel most need to be addressed, with recommendations on how to meet those needs. As I began to prepare for this presentation, I started to reflect on some of the commonalities that I have shared with this population. One of those was having parents with limited educational experiences and resulting lower incomes. This is also the reality of many parents of the youth in our system, and the usual outcome is that their children have fewer opportunities for success. Additionally, my parents separated when I was 13 years old. Consequently, I was raised in a single-parent household with a mother who struggled every day to provide for our family's basic needs. Money was very tight, and we used food stamps to supplement her income. And I can tell you, I can still vividly remember the embarrassment that I felt when we went shopping with those food stamps. I would also bet you that many of the children who we are discussing here today experience similar feelings of inadequacy as they face the obstacles that poverty imposes upon their lives. A critical protective factor that I had was that despite my parents' own limited academic experiences, they understood the value of education, and they pushed me to excel. School was important to me because even then, I knew it was my way out of poverty. While my family did not know how to maneuver through the educational system, there were educators in my high school who broke down barriers that could have easily prevented me from obtaining my goals. I'd like to tell you about my very special guidance counselor. Her name was Vera Williams, and due to her diligence and effort, my fees for the PSAT and the SAT were waived. She also convinced every college to which I applied to waive their application fees. Thanks to her dedication and caring, I received a full scholarship. Her job did not require her to do those things, but what a difference her actions made in my life. The support of individuals like Mrs. Williams can truly affect the course of our lives. We must challenge ourselves to make that same kind of positive impact on the lives of youth who enter the juvenile justice system. Another factor that helped to keep me on the right path was my faith. And I will say to you that now I am not speaking as executive director of the juvenile justice system. I'm exercising my right to free speech when I tell you that I give God the credit for making the difference in my life. But I also believe that God works through people to get his job done, and that we can all play a part in preventing our youth from becoming involved in the juvenile justice system. In fact, I think it's our collective responsibility to do that. The reason that I decided to share some of the more difficult parts of my life with you today was to underscore the fact that we cannot underestimate the potential of any child based on his or her current life circumstances. We are obligated to do what we can to enable children to become their personal best. We owe that to them, and I believe that's why we're here today. So it is with that realization that I selected the areas of the juvenile justice system that I feel need priority attention. They are the continued reduction in the number of juveniles who enter the system, the efficient and effective delivery of services, the elimination of barriers to educational success, the expansion of supervision options in our communities, and the need to provide specific and individualized support mechanisms that will help young people succeed long-term and ultimately reduce recidivism. Since my first area of concern is to reduce the number of children in our juvenile justice system, we must help young people avoid involvement in the first place. If we can deliver services to youth who demonstrate risk factors and provide the support that they need, we would have a much greater chance of helping them out of the juvenile justice system, as well as the adult system of corrections. We must work to establish a full range of programs that address recognized needs and have proven to be successful. Options should include those programs designed to strengthen families, reduce truancy, prevent bullying, create safe school environments, and foster character development. Young people and their families need supportive services as well. If a juvenile can gain access to counseling to help manage their anger, aggression, or issues resulting from abandonment or abuse, we may be able to prevent him or her from acting out in an inappropriate way, a way that often lands a juvenile in a police department or a county detention center. Law enforcement also has a role in prevention. Station house adjustments provide critical opportunities to intervene with youth. Successful station house adjustments will divert juveniles from formal court proceedings and prevent them from establishing juvenile records. An important factor in reducing our detention population has been New Jersey's acceptance as a replication site for the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, better known as JDAI. This initiative provides a framework of strategies that help reduce the inappropriate use of secure juvenile detention. A primary goal of JDAI is to make sure that secure detention is only used to ensure that serious and chronic youthful offenders are detained. JDAI is currently in place in 10 of the 17 New Jersey counties operating juvenile detention centers, but it must be implemented statewide to create true systematic change. The JJC and its county partners are working very hard to see that JDAI is expanded to all counties operating detention centers by 2010. While we can prevent many children from reaching the doors of the JJC, we need to make sure that their needs are effectively met once they are committed to our care. This is the second key policy area that I believe needs attention. In order to make positive changes in the lives of young people, we must consider the risk factors and behaviors that contributed to their delinquent behavior. The JJC has implemented a needs assessment that will aid us in the development of an individualized rehabilitation plan that will monitor juveniles' progress in documented areas of need. That plan will be followed from intake until discharge from parole supervision, with adjustments being made along the way as needed. The third priority issue that can produce dramatic results for young people by enhancing opportunities for educational success. We at the JJC have made a commitment to increase the number of students who graduate from high school or obtain their GEDs, as well as to realize measurable increases in standardized test scores and in the number of high school credits obtained prior to release. It is critical that the educational program delivered to students at our facilities is a fully integrated educational experience. In addition to delivering the required core curriculum, we are providing students with educational experiences and the skills necessary to enter and remain current in the competitive and ever-changing job market. To fulfill this goal, the JJC is expanding its use of educational technology through online learning experiences. At some point, every juvenile under our supervision will return home. When that happens, they need to have structure and support. So the fourth policy area that I would like to address is the expansion of supervision options for juveniles within the community. Juveniles are assigned parole officers who oversee their compliance with the requirements of their individual parole plans. But for parole to be successful, it cannot begin on the juvenile's first official day of parole. We are in the process of implementing a plan that allows parole officers and their parolees to develop stronger relationships. Officers will now have a caseload comprised of juveniles who are currently on parole, as well as some who still reside in JJC facilities. This will allow parole officers to better align necessary community services and resources for parolees. Another integral part of reentry services is to recognize the importance of family involvement in a juvenile's parole. Parents and guardians need to be included in discharge planning, so the JJC has installed video teleconferencing equipment to ensure that parents can participate in release planning if they are unable to attend in person. In an effort to increase opportunities for success on parole, the JJC opened 3 transitional programs located in the cities of Newark, Camden, and Trenton. These programs are designed to help juveniles practice their parole plans in the community prior to a full-time return home. We plan to expand these opportunities to additional sites statewide. There also needs to be flexibility in how we respond to technical parole violations. A step-up, step-down process that takes into consideration how the juvenile meets goal expectations and the seriousness of parole violations is being developed. For instance, in some cases, instead of automatically automatically returning a juvenile to secure care for a technical violation, resources may be used creatively to provide support in the community. Available options might include allowing a juvenile to return for a short time to a nearby transitional living facility or to a residential community home from which he or she was discharged. A short adjustment period may be all that that child needs to get back on track. The provision of support systems for youth in their communities is the last policy area that I would like to address. Juveniles need links to their communities. Mentors can play a role, introducing young people to new opportunities. Mentors can do more than offer words of wisdom. They can often be the difference between success and failure. Similarly, because careers are so critical to future success, job coaches must be made available to young people. Continuity of social services is also critical to a juvenile's success. Many of our residents receive some type of counseling or therapy during their time with us. Outpatient counseling needs to be put into place for each young person who requires it. Likewise, the medical needs of these youth must continue to be met upon their release. They need medical coverage so that they can receive necessary medications and can be treated for diagnosed chronic health concerns as well as emergencies. Young people are more likely to succeed if primary needs such as medical care are met. In conclusion, I would like to say that New Jersey has made great strides in the area of juvenile justice. The governor's attention to crime prevention and reentry and the state's comprehensive response affords New Jersey the opportunity to make significant system reforms. It will require creativity, resourcefulness, and partnerships, but I am confident that we will not only see improved services delivered to young people at all points along the continuum, but also significant reduction in the number of juveniles coming into the juvenile justice system and an increase in the number of success stories exiting the juvenile justice system. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity. This morning was incredible. I think we heard from some very, very smart people, and I look around the room, I see a lot of very influential people in our juvenile justice system all around the room. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. But I think we have a tremendous opportunity here to use a lot of very valuable information to make significant changes in the way we interact with kids in our juvenile justice system. And I hope we take that opportunity. I think there's a real value to understanding the empirical information about how we interact with kids. And I think it's a system-wide responsibility, an individual and a system-wide responsibility to understand that information for everyone who provides a service to, represents, advocates for, makes decisions about kids in the juvenile justice system. It should be a personal obligation to understand what works and what doesn't for those kids. And it's a shared responsibility. We ought to make this information available, but we all ought to own that. And when we operate without good empirical information, we tend to operate on anecdote, on assumption, on ideology, and operating on those bases tends only to inure to the detriment of the kids we serve. So, I love this opportunity to share the available information, to have the opportunity to think about it and how it affects how we interact with kids. So five areas, I think, and I come from the behavioral health world. I love the juvenile justice system. It's a passion of mine. It's certainly, I consider our agency a quasi-juvenile justice agency. A good third of the kids we serve in our out-of-home treatment settings are there by virtue of a delinquency order, and so many of our kids are jointly involved, and so but I come at this from a little bit different angle, and so I may have some different ideas about what I think the top priorities are for the juvenile justice system. And my first would be transitioning our system from a deficit-based model to a strengths-based model. And I think that is it's a massive shift for the juvenile justice system, and more so maybe than any other system. Kids come to the juvenile justice system by virtue of having broken the law. And so we start from a place of deficit. This kid did something wrong, and we have to respond to that as a system, as a society. And so understanding a broader context for that kid is sometimes very difficult. And so understanding that kids have, in addition to deficits, in addition to needs and problems, they have strengths, they have talents, they have family. Many of our kids, most of our kids, I think we tend to operate from a place of thinking that a lot of our kids don't have families, but most do. Now, they operate at very different levels of strength, but we have opportunities to capitalize and strengthen those families. And they have teachers, they have mentors, coaches, pastors, youth ministers. They have connections, friends, and we need to capitalize on those strengths for kids in order to make the best possible outcome. Kids are inherently resilient, and when we sever the ties of strength for kids, we tend to make worse outcomes, not better for them, even when we think we're trying to do something great to help them. So transitioning our system from a deficit-based model where we think of kids as a bundle of problems we have to fix to a human being who has all kinds of needs and all kinds of strengths, and we ought to think about how we capitalize on the strengths and address those needs in a sort of comprehensive and individualized way is a massive challenge. Our juvenile justice systems tend to have, in many places, been developed on a very punitive model, right? And large training schools, replete with mechanical restraints and isolation, and that has tended to be how we respond to kids. And making a shift when we have detention officers and corrections officers who've been trained in the police training academy who view their job primarily as law enforcement is very difficult. Convincing them that there's a different way to approach kids is very challenging. I don't envy your job. But understanding that there is a different way to approach kids and that way is actually far more effective in the long run is a massive challenge and a shift for our juvenile justice system. The second is really systems integration, and this morning we heard a lot about multi-system involved kids and a lot about systems integration. And I tend to think about this in a slightly different way. I've had the opportunity to think about this as a volunteer, as an attorney representing kids, as an advocate, and as a systems administrator, and to think about how we do systems integration. And systems integration tends to start with systems. We tend to start in a place where we think about the needs of our systems and how do we share information, right? And how do we respond to each other's time frames, and how do we make professionals talk to one another. And I think that's fundamentally the wrong place for systems integration to start. Systems integration has to start with kids. And so we have to jointly understand the needs of kids in all their complexity, right? Kids are not mad or bad or sad or can add. There are many times 2 or 3 or all of those things. And we have to have a multidisciplinary approach to understanding what those needs are and how we respond to them, rather than starting in a place where we're trying to make our systems work better together. We should be thinking about how we understand the kids we jointly serve and how we respond to them better, not to each other. And that's hard. Systems, in my experience, are much more resilient even than kids. They tend to get their way. They do it by policy or regulation or court order or contempt threat. They get their way. Kids very rarely get their way. They very rarely get heard or understood in the process of planning, and it's very much tied in with taking a strength-based approach. We have to listen to the needs of kids, and just as an example of that, I had a conversation with a public defender a couple of years ago, and we were talking about a particular kid where those involved with the kid, he was in detention, and they were looking for a residential treatment center, but the people involved with this kid really thought he could go home and do well and be successful in the treatment program at home. And the public defender opposed that. She said, no, I don't think this kid should go there. And so I had to try to have a frank conversation. Well, what's that about? And her response was, well, if this kid goes home, he's far more likely to pick up a new charge, which means he'll go to Jamesburg, and that's the worst possible outcome for this kid. And you know, I think she had every good intention. Every good intention. She was not bad. She wasn't, a bad person. But she was operating from a very narrow framework about how we interact with kids. She was trying to protect this kid from the worst possible outcome, and in that process, likely compromising any good outcome for that child. And so I think we all have an obligation to understand that systems need to respond to kids from where they are, and to understand that they're more than a problem that we need to fix, or a risk that we need to address by putting them in a safe place. So third, disproportionate minority contact. I think, I wanted to talk to Sean about this. Maybe unless you're running back to Louisiana, we'll get the chance to talk. I think this is a really complex issue. I think when we talk about that kids in the child welfare system, and particularly deeper into the child welfare system, tend to be more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system, but we know that minority youth are far more involved with the child welfare system, and we know that there are social sort of interactions that are connected through all across our systems that tend to make minority kids more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system and end up deeper into the juvenile justice system. And we see that certainly in the behavioral health world. African American kids make up about a third of the kids in our community-based programs and 50% of the kids in our residential treatment centers. So we know that it's a problem that certainly is a significant problem for the juvenile justice system. It's a problem for child-serving systems generally, and it's about how we interact with and understand kids, and I think it should be a response that is child-serving system response, not a juvenile justice response. I think it's a bigger responsibility. So, I think our joint response to that problem will result in, I think, more success than a single agency or a single system attempting to respond to that issue. I think those are certainly my top three, and there are much smarter people in the room than I on all of those. And the fifth area, and again, I think these are all very well connected, is moving from an incarceration model, an incarceration approach to kids to a community-based approach. Now, on the behavioral health side, we've tried to move from an institutional model of residential treatment for all kids to a community-based approach, both in the way that we do sort of truly in-home, community-based care, but also in the way we do out-of-home treatment. So when we've stood up new programs for troubled kids that are out-of-home treatment, that are really intensive treatment programs, removing kids from their homes, we're trying to do that in small settings, in neighborhoods and communities, and keeping kids connected to schools and families and coaches and all those things that tend to make them more resilient. And that's hard, because those houses where we put those kids have neighbors. And many of you may have seen last year, August of last year, we tried to do this in the neighborhood of Cherry Hill, and we met a lot of community resistance. And and this was a program for 8 to 12-year-olds. It was a program for kids with some pretty significant risk behaviors, but mostly kids who experienced a lot of trauma in their life, and certainly did not, in my view, sort of present a real risk to the community. But the community responded as though they did. And so on a hot August night, we went to a town hall meeting with 300 people, and we're told we should send these kids to Mars and to farms and everywhere else that you can imagine. And in a real act of political bravery, we had a legislator in the room who stood up and said, "These are your kids. You have to care for them like all of us. And if you don't take that responsibility, who will?" And so, I think the challenge of moving from a model of incarceration, in a sense, I equate this to the mental health system, where, by and large, adult mental health systems still, and many children's mental health systems, operate around the state hospital. And all the responses to people come sort of around either risk of hospitalization, leaving the hospital, and that means that there are lots of people who we could do lots of really good work with that we never touch, because they're not in that sphere around the state hospital. In the same way, I think we need to move beyond the training school or the sort of whatever our incarceration model is in whatever state we happen to be in, and think more broadly about how we interact with kids earlier in ways that are both preventive and community-based. So that's number 5, and I think that's a real challenge. There are all kinds of political issues that have to get dealt with in the process of moving from an incarceration model to a community-based model. We certainly experienced that in Cherry Hill. Ultimately, we didn't put houses in that community. We didn't feel like those kids could be safe, and that was hard for us. But we learned a lot about what it meant to create programs for kids and communities, and we've done this all over the state. So it's not as if that has derailed our efforts, but it certainly makes it hard for kids who live in Cherry Hill and neighboring towns to get access service that's near where they live and near their families. And finally, I would say a really major challenge, and certainly Elizabeth talked about this, is how do we integrate the growing body of knowledge around adolescent development into all phases of our responses to kids. And so from how we do jurisdictional transfers, and certainly Elizabeth talked a lot about this, and how we structure our rehabilitative responses to kids, and how we do intervention, how we do either incarceration or punitive response, or do we take a different approach and understand developmentally there may be more effective methods of intervention with kids. And there's certainly a whole body of empirical information about that, and there's a real challenge for the juvenile justice system to take that, integrate it, and have a much more robust and effective response to kids that's developmentally appropriate. So that's my 5 areas. I don't know that I have a whole lot of solutions, but I certainly think that what we understand today is a lot more than what we understood 10 and 20 years ago, that we have lots of opportunities to integrate real information about kids into our practice in a way that can be really effective. And our challenge is really, how do we do that? How do we take research and turn it into practice in a way that ultimately benefits our kids? Thanks.
Okay, good afternoon. How are you? I think I'm like one of the last speakers before you and your weekend, standing in the middle, so I'm going to try to keep your attention and make this concise. I have to say this is a particular honor for me. I grew up about 5 miles from here, and when Professor Scott was talking, I was actually remembering some of my own delinquent activity, which involved wading in that really cool fountain, right out by the Woodrow Wilson School. Before I start, I also want to just take a moment. I wanted to commend Valeria Lawson, but maybe she stepped out of the room. Oh, for just tremendous strides and vision for the Juvenile Justice Commission, and I was incredibly impressed and moved by your words, so thank you so much. Okay, I was asked to highlight what I believe are the 5 key policy issues that need to be addressed by New Jersey's juvenile justice system, but in my brief time with you, I'm going to talk about one. We constantly hear about gaps in service when it comes in health care, and today I want to talk about a gap that children face when it comes to access to counsel. I believe the number 1 problem facing New Jersey's vulnerable kids is that they don't have access to counsel once the trial is over. All morning long, we've been talking about the complexities of the juvenile justice system and the complex problems that these children have, and I believe that they absolutely need an advocate to help them until they are completely out of the system. Post-dispositional advocacy is critical not only to the child's rehabilitation, but to the accountability of the system as a whole. We know that for most kids, the amount of time they spend in front of a juvenile court judge lasts for just a few moments, but the amount of time they can spend in the juvenile justice system can last for years. For New Jersey kids, once they're put on probation or in placement, they really have no advocate to make sure that what the judge ordered is actually occurring. They lack access to counsel post-disposition because unless there is an appeal or a formal post-conviction proceeding, the Office of Public Defender's representation generally ends. I recently saw a PBS show about an 11-year-old girl named Mary Wade, and in 1787 she was found guilty of locking another girl in a bathroom and taking her clothes. After she was found guilty, the judge sentenced her to transport, which means he put her on a boat and sent her to Australia. I was struck by the similarities between 1787 England and our current juvenile justice system. For example, like in Mary's case, in New Jersey, because there are no mandatory review hearings, judges often have no idea what happens to the child once they receive their disposition. Also, like Mary, once most New Jersey kids are sent to a program, they do not have access to an attorney. And finally, like Mary, the New Jersey children who end up in secure care are often poor. In fact, a third of the children who end up in the Juvenile Justice Commission come from Camden, which is the poorest city in the country. National standards, including the National Association of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, have repeatedly recognized that children need zealous advocacy in this stage. There are many reasons why they need advocacy here, but for me, the top two are to prevent institutional abuse and to improve system accountability. If we improve system accountability, we'll get better outcomes for youth and hopefully decrease recidivism. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about institutional abuse. This issue is of particular importance to me because during the 15 years I spent as a public defender, I represented many children who were abused or killed in facilities. One of the realities of doing this kind of work is that sometimes you remember things you would rather forget. I remember stories and faces, and even though it's been years now, in my mind I can clearly see the picture of Walter in his coffin. He was killed after a lengthy restraint, and his face was covered with rug burn scabs. What I have since learned is that abuse in facilities is a national problem. Every year, all over the country, children are committed by courts to placements where they are subsequently abused, by staff or by residents. In 2004, there were 2,800 reports of sexual violence against youth and 26 deaths in facilities. And in 2007, the states of Maryland, Texas, and New York made headlines for these types of abuses. The factors that contribute to these abuses are as follows. 1, kids are often placed far from home and lack access to their family. Kids lack access to attorneys while in placement. Judges and probation officers often don't know about problems. And there, of course, are built-in disincentives that discourage kids from reporting problems. I mean, if you take a moment and think about it, if you were a child in a placement, would you report the problems that you were encountering? I've only been practicing in New Jersey, juvenile law in New Jersey, for a short time, but I come from Pennsylvania, where post-dispositional protocols have been in place for decades. I was trained to believe that monitoring my clients' progress until they were completely out of the system was my job. So once I got here, in order to keep track of my clients in the Children's Justice Clinic, I visit, make phone calls, and make sure that my clients' families know how to get in touch with me in case there are problems. I recently got a phone call from the sister of a client. She told me that her brother, who had been placed in a program, was in the hospital because someone from another gang beat him up. I visited my client to confirm what happened, and he told me that while he was sweeping the floor, another resident attacked him. He was knocked unconscious, beaten about the face, and lost one of his front teeth. In order to keep him safe from further attacks, the program had then placed him in isolation, which meant that for 23 out of 24 hours a day, he was locked in a room. Since it was clear to me that he was not safe in that program, I was able to work with the program and the court to get him transferred to another facility. The second reason post-dispositional advocacy is so important is to improve system accountability. We all rely on this. Prosecutors need it to protect public safety. Taxpayers need it so they're not wasting money. Children need it so they can actually get good treatment before they return to the community. Hang on, not quite. Even though everyone has good intentions, mistakes do happen. Mistakes happen. I recently had a client in Camden who was sent to a drug treatment program in New Jersey. After a month or so, the clinical students checked up on him, and he wasn't doing so well. The program was actually thinking about discharging him. After meeting with the child, we found out the reason he wasn't doing so well was because it was a program for Spanish-speaking children. My client didn't speak Spanish. Because he had an advocate, we were able to address the situation and move him to a more appropriate program. I want to look at the example of the Vision Quest program in New Lisbon, New Jersey. In April of 2007, the Office of Child Advocate halted admissions to the program because of conditions issues. According to the report, there were excessive use and misuse of restraints, and 187 children had eloped in 4 months. 17 had been reported missing. Now, of course, I applaud the Office of the Child Advocate for halting admissions. However, an accountable system would have worked to support the Vision Quest program and remediate the problems when the first 5 kids eloped. The fact that it took 187 kids is partially a byproduct of the lack of post-dispositional advocacy. If these children had had an attorney who kept in contact with them to monitor their progress, hopefully information would have been relayed back to the court and other stakeholders who could have addressed the situation before it got to that level. In 2005, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges released juvenile delinquency guidelines, and Key Principle 13 states that juvenile delinquency court judges should ensure effective post-dispositional review is provided to each delinquent for as long as the youth is involved in any component of the system. It actually goes on to say not only, should the council talk to the youth independently and the parents and the provider, but that post-disposition review should happen not less than every 90 days. If we want to get serious about improving outcomes for vulnerable youth, we need more integration, more information, and I believe that access to counsel post-trial is a critical component of this. We've heard the statistics this morning. These children have mental health issues. These children come from impoverished communities. 40% of the children who are in the juvenile justice system in New Jersey come from the dependent system. These kids need an advocate. This is not really that complicated. We need someone to check in on them, to visit, to show up, and to ask questions. It's the same principles we use when we have our own children in daycare or when we place an elderly relative in assisted living. Now, how are we going to pay for this? Okay, I'm sure that's what you're asking. We want to have reform, but we don't want to spend any money. I got that. So, I want to answer that question first by looking a little bit at the money we already spend. If you calculate what research suggests, which is that it costs about $300 per day per kid, we're spending approximately $110,000 per year for a child to be incarcerated. Just by a point of comparison, that really fancy prep school down the road costs $42,350 per year. The good news is that one of the most important steps has already been taken. The leaders, the juvenile justice stakeholder leaders in New Jersey have recognized this problem and have begun to address it. A collaboration has been formed between the Office of the Public Defender and the law schools at Rutgers, Camden, and Newark, and other juvenile justice stakeholders. And this collaboration was recently awarded a MacArthur grant. You can see this. Here we are, New Jersey, right there. And we are going to be part of a action change network, the Juvenile Indigent Defense Action Network. Hopefully this network will come up with some solutions to deal with access to counsel at the back end of the system. I want to just finish by saying in many ways New Jersey is already a model system. There is an outstanding statewide public defender system that routinely trains its lawyers on all issues. Coming from Pennsylvania, I was astonished at the integrated training that already occurs for all the juvenile lawyers in the state. Incredible progress has also been made through JDAI. But if we want to address this gap in the access to children's counsel, if we address this gap in lack of access to counsel at the back end of the system, I believe it will have the impact of improving system accountability and improving outcome for all our children. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to open it up for questions. I did promise the first mic to Judge Lee Forrester. Most of you know Judge Forrester. He's been a judge a long time here in New Jersey. For those of you who don't know Judge Forrester, his entire professional life has been about kids. Judge Forrester.
Thank you. Mary, but let me just take this opportunity to thank everyone who organized and presented today. This is an extraordinary effort. Over the course of a fairly long career now, I've had the opportunity to hear presentations from many of our presenters and meet a few of them. But I had to spend my whole career doing it, and I had to travel thousands of miles in order to do it, and now we have them brought to us. So thank all of you, ACNJ, Futures for Children, Woodrow Wilson, for everything that you've done here today. Do appreciate it. That being said, I feel like my head's going to explode this afternoon. I feel this way when I go into libraries and bookstores where ideas proliferate because it's so difficult sometimes to get your arms around these ideas and try to find some cohesive way of explaining it or thinking about it or organizing it. I'd like to say, though, that whenever I find myself in the company of child advocates, I feel at home, and so you've created a very home-like and warm environment for us, certainly for me here today. Dr. Steinberg did an absolutely wonderful job of providing an historical overview that set the stage for this discussion, but it sets the stage for a good deal more, I suspect. My own spin, however, on this history, not much different, but if you'd indulge me, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, we had that Cook County juvenile court model, which evolved and dominated the first part of the 20th century. It was an individualized treatment model. It fostered partnership with mental health and child welfare, and the judge was seen as an advocate. Over a period of time, however, there were regrettably abuses, institutionalization largely of children. So in that post-World War II era, we had a critical examination of all of our institutions, this being one of them. Out of that was born In re Galt, ushered in a whole new wave of hope with an emphasis on individualized rights, with the checks and balances of an adversarial system altogether necessary, I might add. Here, too, there were overreactions and unintended consequences, which some have labeled the criminalization of juvenile justice, and we've heard allusion to that today as well. Today, we once again find ourselves on the precipice of hope, because we hope that going forward that we'll be able to retain the best of these two movements and avoid some of the abuses that occurred along the way. Very much the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We've heard some few hints today as to what the future might look like. Screening at the outset of mental health and child welfare cases, or perhaps access to mental health and child welfare services from the juvenile justice system. My own hope, though, is that we won't have to choose between one or the other, and that we might be able to do both. Let me, however, along the way offer a cautionary note, because we've got some infrastructure work to do. If we truly want a different system for our kids, then I'm afraid we're going to have to build it, because we really don't have it now. We have it in some places. There's some pockets in this state and in this country, but we don't have a comprehensive system of juvenile justice. We talk as though we do, but we won't. As long as we continue to use the juvenile justice system, I would suggest, as a training ground for the adult criminal justice system. So if we continue to have prosecutors and defense attorneys and send them to juvenile court to develop the skill sets necessary to earn their promotions to a criminal justice system, or if we tell our juvenile detectives and juvenile probation officers that if they learn their lessons well in juvenile, that they'll be allowed to handle the really important cases, until we create career paths for people who have the interest and predisposition to work in this area and in fact are recruited for just such traits, until we convince our community and its leaders that this work isn't just worthy work, but it's critical work, and that what is necessary to succeed here is not at all like what is required in that other system. In other words, until we learn what our brethren in the mental health system have known all along, that working with adolescents is not a precondition to working with an adult population, but rather a specialty area of practice, which requires special training for those who choose this area and who demonstrate proficiency in this area. So until we create a culture where this worthy work is valued for what it is, we will never have a true juvenile justice system, which is anything but a reflection of that adult system. You know, the problems that I'm referencing here are not universal in the country or in the state. There are wonderful examples of public defenders and prosecutors, some of whom are in this room today. The problem is we seem to travel in packs, and wherever there's a conference like this, we all show up there. You know, but if you look around and take a census, there's a handful of us. You know, and that doesn't create the din, the critical mass, the drumbeat that we're going to need to produce in order to take this effort to its next level, in order to have the synthesis that we all hope for. And I'm not talking about money here, at least I don't think so. I'm talking about culture. I'm talking perhaps about a paradigm shift. We've been talking about this juvenile justice system for so long, it's like the emperor's set of clothes. We really think that it exists, whereas it exists, I would suggest, for some of us, and others are just passing through. If we truly want it, we're going to have to build it. Much work has been done, but much work needs to be done. And that would be my reaction and my comment.
Thank you, Judge. Any other questions, comments? Everybody's? Which?
Component that you obviously need in order to find out whether what you're talking about actually has the possibility of occurring in real life. In the ideal policy the justice system has had since its inception, we've had very little evidence that has been over this work. And unless we can find out where are the structures for research and relationships, not only integration within the whole system, between those universities and other places that have the capability to help you in terms of conducting top-notch social science research. And this is really some of the stuff that's in this book. And so, in order to do that, there has to be attention to it, and there has to be money. There has to be that I don't give in terms of anything.
You know, I couldn't agree more. We, in DCF, I think we are trying to build a research infrastructure, both, you know, I think it's absolutely valuable for us to evaluate our programs internally and to engage, you know, external researchers from universities and foundations and wherever else they may be in doing that kind of evaluation. But we're starting to do that. You know, I think it's always a difficulty of prioritization. We all have very limited resources, and you know, sometimes the question becomes, do I pay for a research study or do I pay for a service for a kid? And you know, I don't really enjoy being put in that situation of making that kind of a judgment. But you know, I was actually talking to Tom. We took a look at the implementation of. We implemented our local behavioral health systems of care in counties all across the state on a rolling basis. And so we took a look at JJC admissions pre and post implementation. We did a regression analysis, you know, a very strong analysis, and we were able to do that analysis in 9 places. In 6 of them, we found statistically significant reductions in admissions post implementation. So we found a really strong link between implementing a community-based mental health system for kids and reduction in admissions to juvenile justice programs. We did the same analysis for our acute care inpatient system, which you would think there would be a much more direct link, and while there was some reduction, it was not nearly as clear or as strong. And that's stuff we're working on publishing to let people know, you know, in a broader context. But you know, I think we certainly want to be invested in using we have a ton of data, and we need to be able to use it in a way that informs practice going forward, both in looking at who we're good at serving and who we're not, and what should we do about that. I think it's critical.
I also agree, but I would say that certainly we're not where we would like to be at the JJC, but we do have, we're moving in that direction. We do have a research and evaluation unit that has begun to monitor what's successful and what's not. We also have detention specialists, 5 of them, specifically hired to monitor the success of JDAI. And the money is an issue for some of the therapeutic things that we want to put into place, because certainly we don't have the services available now that we would like to have. But if we get the money to do some of the things that we are proposing, we have developed a strategic plan at the JJC to form a systematic approach. Of course, I couldn't cover everything in these comments today, but we have a systematic approach that we've developed to address all these things. Some of those things will require money, but any of the therapeutic modalities that we put in place will be those that already have a record of documented success.
I had a question about the availability of data as well. First of all, I wanted to thank all the presenters on this panel and all the panels today for a great day of learning and sharing of information. I really appreciate the opportunity to have been here as one of the group learning here. Professor Simkins, I thought your presentation was with all the others, very, very compelling, particularly some of the slides that you put up, which indicated that that the issues that we're dealing with are historic in nature, going back perhaps to the beginning of time. But one of the slides in particular I found very interesting, and that was the one of the United States that had various colors for incidents of various types that had occurred. And I was just wondering if that was a snapshot in time, or were we confined to all time for that?
No, in fact,
those conditions. I didn't see.
In fact, that was something that I've just been putting together. I keep track of articles that come around in the country, and so I did that. And it came from, reports from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I'm not saying that's completely accurate. In fact, I think that if I had more information, every state would have something. Some states had not turned their data in to the OJJDP. So,
and
yes.
that's something that I think would be tremendously helpful if there were resources that could be given to the institutes, the universities in each of the states to track not only the negative incidents or outcomes, but the positive occurrences in the various systems that are impacting the lives of kids. And if we can make that data available, I mean, we're in the 21st century and computer age, and it seems to me like that sort of thing should be so immediately available that, driving, now we are ready to head out the door, but driving up the Turnpike or down the Garden State Parkway, we could see, that sort of information, and the people that we need as allies to buy into this, who are driving up and down the byways and the highways here, could have it right there. So that's something I thought would be very, very helpful. And then reaching out to allies that we do have in our communities. I know that Mayor Cory Booker in the city of Newark is tremendously concerned and involved, and we need to get more people like him at meetings like this, and then take meetings like this to other parts of the state and the country. So thank you all very much for the presentations.
It was back there. Is there another question over here?
Hi. I was also very moved by your presentation, and I just had one or two questions, especially kind of about the nature of the beast that is New Jersey. I agree totally with the prevention of institutional abuse, although I think it needs to spread across all the systems that we have in New Jersey. It's not just, unfortunately, juvenile justice that we have to worry about. But since we have a history of liking separate but not equal, whether it's school, whether it's treatment, and we like to segregate people in New Jersey, whether we want to admit it or not. And when these important decision-making forums happen, that education always seems to be missing. How do we make those system change happen? When we have a Department of Children and Families that doesn't include all the children of New Jersey or all the important divisions that include children in New Jersey. How do we protect kids from restraints and aversives when it happens in not only detention but in treatment homes and in public schools? And, you know, to wrap your head around it and then try to look at it from a systems accountability and systems change piece. So I just wanted some thoughts about that.
That's a big question. In terms of changing systems, I mean, I think that systems being changed is happening right here, and it happened there was a similar conference several weeks ago at the Youth Summit, and I'm incredibly impressed how New Jersey stakeholders keep coming together to talk about these issues. And I think that it will continue to happen. In terms of the accountability piece, I don't think there's a substitute for having people check in on individual children and then doing something with that information. I do think it's as basic and as simple as that, having someone check in and report back to the judges or to the program or whatever. I want to put a caveat, though, on I know that institutional abuse is a national problem. I don't know, in fact, that it's happening to that degree in New Jersey. I don't know that. I don't know that. I've been here for a very short time. It's just a particular issue that's of concern to me. I know that when there are conditions where, kids don't have a lot of access, it does occur, but I'm not saying that the kinds of slides that you saw up here are happening in New Jersey. I'm not saying that at all. Yeah. But I'd like to turn this over to somebody else in terms of moving systems and changing systems. I think that systems are changing. They continue to change. The work of Bob Schwartz for the past 30 years and all the other illustrious speakers that we've have enacted incredible change. I also disagree that it takes an incredible amount of money to do the data and the research. I actually think that a whole lot can be done without a lot of money, and things have happened, whether it's anecdotal evidence that gets presented to stakeholders that enacts change or state assessments that get done. Change does happen, not necessarily just by one huge university research study.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that there is a need for increased communication and cooperation with all of these systems and education, because education is the system that's overarching with all of the other populations. So I agree with you that we need to make sure that they're involved.
And I would just add one other comment on education. It's been my experience in working with different stakeholder groups that unfortunately some of us forget to invite the schools to the meeting. And we need to be more vigilant about it. I've been in too many meetings sometimes where somebody says, well, now we have to mandate the schools to do this, and we've never asked them to the table. So I think the invitation would be helpful. Anybody else have any other questions?
This is a group that obviously values research, and I'd like to ask anybody, but I guess especially Larry Steinberg, maybe Bob Schwartz, what they see in the future regarding the availability of funding for research in these areas. In Massachusetts, we're looking at less money, and I think probably a lot of states are, just for the economic downturn, and we're expecting the state to put less money into research. Much of it that we do in my program at UMass. On the other hand, one can be possibly optimistic about new administration federally. I'm just curious.
We were addressing this issue in Pennsylvania yesterday at our state advisory group meeting in Harrisburg, and we've invested in the National Center for Juvenile Justice to try to build a new body of evidence-based programming through a quality improvement project. And probably the first 2 or 3 years, there's very little in the way of research along the way because there is no money for it. So what we are trying to do is to require in the programs in the state the building of data sets that would allow for research to happen when the cycle turns, so that we know that research is very expensive if you have to start from scratch doing your data collection as well as analysis. So what we're trying to do is to create a situation in which the data will be present and that the investments later down the line will be less expensive for analysis. I mean, that was our shorthand version yesterday.
I think it's important to think differently about the legislative process and the appropriations process in that allocating a certain percentage of funding for programs or services to research on their effectiveness ought to be routine, and we don't do that. And I don't think we can. I don't think a model by which you expect private foundations and government research agencies to give states money to study their systems is going to be a very viable model over the long run. If there's money for programming, then there's money for research, because a part of that money for programming ought to be allocated to research, because in the end, that's going to allow you to do more programming with less money. And I think that people ought to look at Washington State's model of having this public policy institute that is funded by its legislature, and that is used on a regular basis to do cost-benefit analyses of different policy proposals, so that when legislation is being contemplated, they can look to this institute to do an objective analysis and come back with answers about different alternatives and what their relative costs and benefits are going to be.
Up in the back, the others. Actually, 2 questions up there.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the work in Pennsylvania on the data collection through Penn State, as well as what's done through Steve Eos and his group in Washington State. But it does raise the question, it gets back to the comment by Dr. Steinberg that only 5% of the programs are evidence-based. And it seems to me, having operated some evidence-based programs, including MST, I know they're very expensive. It's taken New Jersey quite some time, and I applaud the child behavioral health, for figuring out a way to use, and I'm sorry I missed your presentation, Brian, to use Medicaid to support MST and FFT. I think that the only way in which it makes sense, and it uses the data analysis to do this comprehensive research collection analysis, as they do in Washington State and they're beginning to do in Penn State, is to more widely adopt these evidence-based programs. Nurse-Family Partnership is another program, and we're struggling to get Medicaid reimbursement for that, as is Pennsylvania. But there are a lot of very good programs, and once you implement those programs, you get licensed, and you're required to document fidelity. And if you're not, and then if you have that link to outcomes in real time, as they do in Washington State, you really can make a lot of progress. But I think we're ahead in many respects in New Jersey, but one area we're behind in, we're just playing catch-up now, is to more widely adopt those evidence-based programs and use that as a basis for data collection and analysis.
And just to follow up on that, to put another plug in for Future Children, there's actually a whole chapter on evidence-based programs. There's a chart in there that shows the evidence-based programs, how they've been evaluated, what their sort of ranking is. So I invite you to look at Peter Greenwood's chapter in the volume.
Yeah, and I would just say to that, I would love that our entire system, everything we do, be evidence-based. I think we have to look to a slightly broader, we want to use evidence-supported, evidence-informed practices wherever we don't have an evidence-based practice available. We certainly are working, we have the rough outlines of a plan to sort of shift all of our existing providers towards evidence-based models, asking them to adopt evidence-based models for intervention where they already exist. And but that's a system transition. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think if we're not doing evidence-based practice, we're not doing good work. So that's where we should be. And I think sometimes providers don't quite understand how to do that, or they're not. Unless we tell them, they're not going to invest. So we want to get them to invest, and we want to help them along the way, and hopefully they understand. And really, we hope, in many ways, when we're working with a lot of existing providers to implement MST and FFT, and we're hoping that helps their organizations understand the value of evidence-based practices, so that they'll export that kind of thinking all across their agencies. So we're really behind. We're playing catch up, but I hope we start sprinting soon.
There's one up here, and there's another question. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say also that I really have appreciated the presentations today, and it's been very thought-provoking, and it gets my wheels turning, and then people know to look out, because I'm getting ready to come up with something, right? No, but seriously, I wanted to just say that one of the things that I wanted us to keep in mind as well is that, yes, it's important for us to think of creative ways to affect policy on a large scale, but I think we also need to keep in mind that each of us, has the ability to affect policy change on a small scale, within each of our agencies, within each of our little units, within each of our collective groups of among our colleagues. And I really encourage everyone, and especially those who have been involved in putting this program together today, to continue what we've been doing here in New Jersey in recent years, and that is continue to have these kinds of collaborative efforts. And we need to think about ways that we can get more people to attend these kinds of events. We need to get our stakeholders to really commit to sending more and more of their staff, more judges, more lawyers, more DIFAS workers, more stakeholders of every sort, because I have found that through the collaborative processes that I've been involved in here in New Jersey, JDAI, now MacArthur, I'm glad to say, have really taught me that all of us come to the table with very different perceptions and biases about, what one another's roles are, and what our abilities are to effectuate change. And I think that by learning from one another, sometimes we end up seeing very creative ways that we can make a difference on a small scale, and it doesn't require legislative change. And by that, as an example, we have policies on, prosecutors have policies on plea negotiations, for example. As we begin to learn from one another, and as we begin to spread the word, maybe some of those policies may change. As we're waiting for the bigger change to happen, if little changes can happen along the way, we may even be able to get additional data and so forth to support the need for greater change. So the bottom line is, what I'm saying is that I really encourage each of us in this room to go back, encourage our superiors and everyone that we come into contact with to continue the collaborative process, find ways that you can get involved in any of the collaboratives that are going on in the state, and continue to brainstorm and dialogue, because I really feel that each of us who comes into contact with a child has the ability to change a life, and we should take that very seriously. and remember the importance or remember what it communicates to a child when they see us as adults acting appropriately, respecting them, listening to them, advocating strongly on their behalf. What kinds of lessons does that teach a child? So every little thing that we do has the ability to impact a child's life, and I just encourage everyone to take that seriously and continue collaborating.
Quick comment to what Brian said about our evidence-based programs, and this is just from my perspective, and maybe I've been around a long time, too long, but I think we need to be really cautious of any mandate for evidence-based programs or the inclusion of, this needs to be done. Because what we historically have seen is based on the trend, the programs have just been recycled under new names and come out as the same old thing. And now it's called evidence-based. And I think most people who do direct services or know how money comes out in this state have seen this historical cycle of just going around and programming. You know, we can't, right now, we should be looking at evidence-based programs, putting them into practice, and putting the data onto the dollars attached to that program, as opposed to, we want you to do this, this, and that, because it's just recycling our dollars, and I think that's one of our downfalls.
So, you know, I think this might be a little bit talking past one another. When I talk about evidence-based practice, I talk about practices that have been documented to be effective with particular populations in rigorously designed research studies that have been replicated over time. And so, I don't think it's right to talk about them as sort of regurgitated models. I think there's... Well, I misunderstood you. Then that's a very different question. I think that speaks to quality monitoring. That speaks to fidelity of implementation. I think that's all. If you talk about evidence-based practice, you have to talk about fidelity of implementation, and or you're not doing evidence-based practice. You're doing something with a name. So that's hugely important. I think the reason why we started with MST and FFT is because, in a way, it allowed us to export that fidelity monitoring to the national organizations who have expertise in implementation. I don't want to have to judge if somebody's doing FFT right, because I don't know. And my staff don't know, but FFT does. So in that sense, that's partly why we started there. But I think that's a critical issue. It's certainly a big part of how we think about when we attach funding to programs we call evidence-based. What does that in fact mean? That's all very important.
Okay. I think there's another question in the back.
Yeah. Hi, just the last two commenters, I just want to follow up on those comments, and this one about evidence-based practices. The one thing I had mentioned in the past couple of years, particularly on a volunteer basis, that we're working with juveniles, and especially in the probation area, and trying to introduce an academic component to probation, because these kids are missing education. But regardless, the evidence-based practices I think are useful, and they can be a tool, and there's a place for them. But those practices were not always evidence-based. They were practices that came up, and they weren't evidence-based. They were just practices that, either because they were widely used or widely implemented or became popular, some research was done to find that they were evidence-based, to create the evidence that they were useful. But I would hate to see an evidence-based practice be used in lieu of some other local practice that's customized for the population that isn't evidence-based because it's new. So I would hate to see evidence-based practices take the place of new practices that just like the evidence-based practice was new at some point as well. It wasn't always evidence-based. The second thing about people doing things that don't require legislative change, I support that wholeheartedly. I think the way adults interface with youth and juveniles make a big difference as to the type of reaction we get from youth. But in terms of legislative and advocacy, there are 2 legislative hearings coming up in December. One on December 8th. There's a legislative hearing to codify, not sure if the audience is familiar with court-appointed special advocates, but it's a volunteer organization, and we advocate on behalf of foster kids, kind of make sure that the system is accountable and providing what the kids need. So there's a hearing in December to codify that. There won't be any funding attached to it, but we hope in future years, when the economy improves, that maybe there might be some more funding to fully implement the CASA program throughout the state. And then the second hearing, there's no date for it yet in December, but there is a date, a legislative hearing on the effects of incarceration on families. So that's the legislature is finally starting to take a look at a developmental perspective as to the effect of incarceration. We've heard about costs and whatnot, and that's causing some changes. So hopefully I'll see some people there. I was asked to speak about that because 40 years ago my father was incarcerated for the first time, and he was incarcerated 3 times over about a 20-year period. But I'm also working with a foster child who is going to appear in front of Judge Forrester next Friday. So I also plan to attend a hearing to talk about the effect that his incarceration is having on his younger sisters, who are also under DIFAS's custody. So, so I hope to be able to use some of the information I got here for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, but be very careful about any ex parte communication on that case. I'd like to thank all our panelists, and then I'd just like to turn it over back to Elizabeth Donahue for closing remarks.